Red Riding Hood is the story we tell kids about a girl who takes a stroll through the woods, meets a big bad wolf, gets eaten by that wolf, and then is saved at the last minute by a dashing huntsman. But you know what? That's not how the story originally went. In fact, the original version of Little Red Riding Hood is terrifying, and there's no happy ending. In this episode, we're going to learn about the dark origins of Red Riding Hood and find out why it was that wolves were such a persistent problem in folklore. And now, back to our creepy tale. One modern version vs. original roots. To answer that question, we have to go back in time and see what the world was like when these stories first began circulating. Today, Red Riding Hood is a beloved children's story, but the forests of Europe in the Middle Ages were anything but magical. They were deep, dark, and full of real danger. In the Middle Ages, there were lots of outlaws living in the woods. Some were simply poor people who had no other option, while others were dangerous criminals on the run. And although she should say no, she agrees. And that leads to her demise. Either way, the woods were a lawless place, and there was no telling who or what you might encounter there. We imagine a cute little girl wearing a red hooded cape, walking through the woods to deliver some goodies to her sick grandmother. In some tellings, the wolf represents kidnappers. In others, rapists or even killers. Either way, you shouldn't trust anyone who lures you away from the safety of the village, especially if they try to trick you with false promises of gifts. And the wolf doesn't just eat her, he eats her grandmother too. The original stories were never meant to entertain children. For Perrault, this was a clear warning. Young girls should never show off their bodies in public, because that could attract the wrong kind of attention. Instead, there were scary stories meant to keep kids on the straight and narrow. On the way, she meets a friendly wolf who tries to trick her, but a handsome huntsman appears just in time to save her and her granny. After the wolf eats Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, a huntsman comes to rescue them. She's never rescued, and no one even looks for her. The message here is clear. If you leave the safety of your house, you do so at your own risk. In most early versions, no one comes to save Red Riding Hood. She and her grandmother are devoured by the wolf. And that's the end of the story. And although it's unclear how he manages to pull that off, we're told that he cuts the wolf open and the two captives are freed. She could have been taken by a wolf, a kidnapper, or a monster. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she was gone. Parents told these stories to their kids, and the message was clear. Don't wander into the woods, don't talk to strangers, and don't do anything else that might put you in danger. After all, fairy tales often feature talking animals, and we usually assume that's what's happening here. But that may not be the case. The goal was to scare kids into behaving properly. You should never have wandered off on your own. And if you were lucky enough to meet a friendly wolf, you should have run away screaming. The whole point was to scare children into submission. If they misbehaved, they'd be told that the big bad wolf was coming for them, and that was enough to make even the wildest child behave. And his story was definitely meant to be a cautionary tale. They were a way for communities to protect their most vulnerable members, and they continue to remind us of the importance of listening to our elders. So when Perrault wrote his version of Red Riding Hood, he used the wolf as a metaphor for those dangerous men. The woods represent the dangers that young women faced outside the safety of society, and the wolf is a symbol of the men who preyed on them. Back in the 17th century, young girls sometimes walked alone through the woods to visit family members or pick up firewood, and Perrault was worried about them. Stories like Red Riding Hood weren't meant to entertain children, but to teach them valuable lessons about survival. During the Middle Ages, children regularly vanished. Sometimes it was because of hunger, but often it was because of wild animals or human predators. As far as he was concerned, there was no happy ending to this tale. In fact, he was so concerned about the dangers facing young women that he added an even more disturbing detail to the story: happily ever after. Except that's not how the story originally went, and the original versions are a lot darker than the one we tell today. In most early tellings, Red Riding Hood isn't saved and her adventure ends with her being eaten by the wolf. But why? Why was this story used to scare kids? This meant that wolves regularly attacked farm animals, which could be a serious problem for villagers who relied on their livestock to survive. Sometimes they even attacked people. It wasn't unheard of for wolves to target children, so if you were a kid in medieval Europe, it was important to listen to your parents and stay away from the woods. 2. Medieval forests as real danger zones today. Red Riding Hood is set in a forest, a place that's often seen as a symbol of mystery, magic, and the unknown. Wolves lived in those woods, and they were a serious threat. They didn't just stay in the forest. They hunted wherever they needed to find food. But wolves weren't the only danger in those forests. There were also people. So when we think about the original versions of Red Riding Hood, it makes sense that the wolf would symbolize both wild animals and human predators. That's exactly what happens to Red Riding Hood. She meets a stranger in the woods who offers her candy and wine. 3. The wolf as a metaphor. These days, we tend to think of the wolf in Red Riding Hood as a literal wolf. And that makes sense. The French author Charles Perrault published a version of Red Riding Hood that most people are familiar with today. There were plenty of strange men lurking in those woods, and he was concerned that young girls would fall victim to predators. The original versions of the story included a huntsman who saves Red Riding Hood and her grandmother, but Perrault left him out of his story. At one point, the wolf tricks Red Riding Hood by asking her to admire her rear end, and when she does, he devours her. 4. No happy ending. Most versions of Red Riding Hood have a happy ending. Then everyone heads home, presumably to live happily ever after. But that's not how the story originally went. In some tellings, the wolf even disguises himself as Red Riding Hood and tricks her friends into thinking everything's fine, and that's the last we see of her. If you don't follow the rules and stay on the path, you may never come home again. 5. Historical context. Fear and survival during the Middle Ages. Life was tough, and that's reflected in the fairy tales people told. These tales were passed down from generation to generation, and they often contained hidden messages about the dangers of the world. And the truth is, no one really knew where Red Riding Hood disappeared to. When you consider that, it makes sense that these stories included a gruesome warning about what could happen if you strayed from the path. These stories were essentially survival lessons, disguised as bedtime stories. 6. Purpose. When we tell Red Riding Hood today, we're usually trying to entertain children, but that wasn't the purpose of the story when it was first told. If you were a kid during the Middle Ages, it was important to listen to your parents and stay away from the woods. To hear stories like Red Riding Hood and Snow White and then go to sleep without any nightmares was unthinkable. In the end, folk tales like Red Riding Hood served as a warning to others. Thanks for watching. Bye.